Let's just see. All righty, yes, welcome back everybody for our final Talk of Product Summit Day 2. I am really pleased to introduce Andy Ayim. He's going to be speaking to us about moving through adolescence, how to develop autonomous teams, which I know is a very important thing for early stage founders, because you've got to keep that engine running. Andy has a wealth of experience in building products. He is a startup investor himself, and actually runs the Angel Investing School. But Andy, I'll let you say more on your own.
Thank you, Precious, for that very kind introduction. Very excited to be here amongst you all. I hope you're getting a lot of value from being at the summit so far. It's actually funny that I'm giving a talk today on adolescence because everyone calls me a child at heart that works with me. So over the last, I guess, 11 years, I've worked in different guises as a product manager. Okay, I didn't really know the term actually initially when I started my first business before I started working with businesses across Africa and then Hong Kong and then San Francisco. But along the time, I discovered that actually a lot of this customer empathy that I have, a lot of what I love to do in terms of working at the strategic layer, then coming into the details and the weeds of working on a product is called product management. And along that journey, I've also learned how difficult it is to really watch your baby grow as a product when you're a founder. And when that baby grows into that stage of teenage years and those rebellious years where suddenly people are leaving and whatnot, it becomes really difficult to manage that stage of growth. So that's what I'm going to touch on today, actually, like how to actually manage a product team with autonomy during those years of adolescence. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and hopefully that works okay. It has in all of the practice runs, so I'm going to assume that you can see the screen right now. So startup life, like for a lot of people, it means freedom. It means, really being free to explore, to enjoy. There's a youthful euphoria like surrounding what it means to be a founder and actually start a business. Like when we're reading our publications these days, it feels like it's the age of the entrepreneur. And even for first employees, it feels like you're on that same journey too, okay? But then what I've discovered is as soon as those companies grow big and you start working with large enterprises, and I've worked with a number from Investec Bank to Novartis, who's my current client, like a lot of people are crying out for us to be set free. There's too much bureaucracy. Suddenly there's too many layers. Suddenly there's hierarchy, control, governance, reports, admin. And actually, we get a lot further away from the customer and from doing the work that we loved when we were so small, okay? And we're here today to actually try and avoid going into that state of corporate, almost like euphoria, all right? So at that startup phase, when you're that founder, you're by default the first product manager, okay? By default, you're everything, actually. You're the CMO, you're the general manager, you're legal, you're hiring and talent manager, you're everything. But you're that first product manager. And during that time in those early days, there's usually quite a family feel, right? Like you feel like the communication flows well. Everyone knows everyone's name, background, what they like, what they don't like. You hang together a lot. And dare I say, it feels like a family. But then suddenly, like you start suffering from some growing pains as soon as you start to scale. Like suddenly you can't spend as much time as some of the people you did in the first wave. Suddenly there's almost like a subculture emerging from the newer entrants who maybe see things a little bit differently to those who were there from the start. Suddenly there's more experienced people joining, and actually some of the earlier joiners may feel that threat, okay? And then suddenly you have your first leavers. And that's always a pivotal point. Because when that first leaver leaves, a lot of us subconsciously go into defense mode and we take it personal. And then suddenly the experience of the rest of the highs that we make from then going on, we treat slightly differently. Actually, now it's not about being a family. It's more about being a team. And this is a team sport. And I need to put certain processes in place to actually protect myself from making it feel like it's a family. Okay? This might be something that some of you are experiencing literally right now. Then actually, when you get to that next scale of growth and real hyper growth and scale, it becomes really difficult because now you can't be in the weeds like you were at the beginning. You can't be in every single micro decision, like whether you like it or not, you're going to have to hand over some autonomy. You're going to have to hand over some responsibility. And then it becomes this difficult balancing act of really balancing control with that autonomy. So some problems that you face are pretty easy, right? There's certain technical issues and problems such as, having a testing environment or, a staging environment before going into production. And, there's certain aspects of when you're scaling, there's a playbook for it, and it's pretty straightforward in deciding what to do. But actually, there's several aspects of it that is pretty hard. And it always comes down to actually what our previous talk was talking about in terms of culture. And what you start to discover is that silos start emerging, and there is an irony with the Conservative Party, but we're not going to talk party politics today. The important thing to really look at actually in your organizations even today is like, what are the silos that you're noticing are starting to emerge, right? And feel free to even actually start putting that into the chat, put some answers into the chat, like what are the silos you're starting to emerge in your organization today? Okay, and these silos could vary. Okay, it could be misaligned team versus company goals, right? It could be on prioritization, and you feel like teams are not necessarily prioritizing the right things. A typical one that I see, especially in large enterprises and big scale-ups, are managing dependencies across teams. Teams just aren't talking enough, and as a consequence of that, we're harboring risk. And we need to try and reduce those risks and get those teams talking more often. But in doing that, sometimes the anti-pattern that emerges is big meetings, right? Or being stuck in too many meetings, again, which is not something we want to really encourage. One of the difficulties that a lot of founders face in this particular phase of growth also is that capability gaps start emerging. At first, you are hiring for a need, but then you start experiencing hypergrowth and you realize that you need to actually hire for growth. And what we start to discover is that person that we hired for need actually maybe hasn't got the capability to be a manager, let's say, and we haven't got the capacity to train them, right? And these are the kind of things that start causing these silos to emerge, right? So even though it's meant to be one product, it might feel fragmented or federated when you get to this stage of scale, because the product just isn't fitting together as it used to, because we've got all these separate teams and sometimes subcultures creating these silos. As you all know, everyone has a recipe, right? Like there's scores of different processes and frameworks and theories and books that really touch on actually how to deal with this and how to really reduce these silos and get teams working together with autonomy at scale and still feel empowered. All right. So I'm going to walk through some of the more popular ones, and then I'm going to share more about the 6 that I really want to touch on, the 6 key characteristics I want to touch on based on my experience. So the first I think that many people know about is the 5 keys to a successful Google team, right? And it's psychological safety, dependency, structure and clarity, meaning in the work that we do, and the impacts that we're having on the wider world. And I'm going to have links to all of these in the references at the end, so don't worry, you'll get a copy of all of these. I'm happy to share the slides too. The Tuckman model is another very popular one: forming, storming, norming, performing. And actually, what stages are our teams at? And if we don't have long-lived teams and we have team members always changing, how does that impact the dynamics within the team? Are we now storming again as we get used to new members joining and leaving the team? CRISP, who are the consultancy from the Nordics who are responsible for influencing the Spotify agile model, they talk about a number of principles too. And interestingly, actually, when you speak to the CRISP team, they always said that this model at Spotify was never actually intended to be copied, but rather they were focusing on teams. And in doing so, they arrived at a framework that was tailored and worked to the Spotify environment. Then we have sociocracy, right? And the principles that they share around consent, around equivalence, accountability, and transparency, and actually how you create a ground up movement on how we manage empowered teams in a more free way that can be managed in an independent way from our leadership and from our management. Okay. A lot of the time that I've been working in some sort, shape, or form in agile, whether it's Scrum or Kanban or Less or in Nexus or in Safe or in Scaled Agile. There's so many different frameworks I can't even keep up. all right? But the certified Scrum Master also has a playbook around servant leadership, team dynamics, self-organization. Okay, Simon Sinek is another who talks about, Start With Why, which is a very popular book, but also Leaders Eat Last, where he's talking about this concept of having a circle of safety around a team, which is again touching on what Google talked about in terms of psychological safety. And what I've noticed from all of these frameworks really is that they really tie in with two kind of, I guess, books really well. One is Carol Dweck's Growth Mindset, where she compares the difference between a fixed versus a growth mindset and actually what that means in practice. The other is with Daniel Pink and his book Drive, which talks about the need for mastery, autonomy, and purpose in the work that we do. But we're not going to dive into all of these 6 today. Instead, I've taken actually a lot of the commonalities from these 6, and I've framed actually what I see as the 6 key principles for autonomous teams. They are psychological safety, having a common purpose, clear roles, decision-making protocols, feedback systems, and having that environment to really experiment and learn. So let's start with psychological safety. Okay, what does that actually mean in practice? What it means is that team members need to feel safe to take risks and be vulnerable in front of each other. Okay. The first time that I can really relate to this was actually when I joined Ernst & Young about 12 years ago. And at the time, I'd grown up in Tottenham, which is a very multicultural ward, but very different. It felt like 2 worlds apart working at a place like EY. And I remember one of my managers at the time, who was a director, asking me, why am I so quiet and shy? And I tried to explain to her, that I'm not shy, I'm just observing and learning, because actually there's a different vernacular and a way of carrying yourself in an environment like this. And through our discussions, I later discovered when I look back that I was probably 60% of my true self, because I didn't feel like I had the psychological safety there. And the downside of that experience is that if I'm not actually my true self, that means I'm not actually doing my best work as a result of that. I'm not actually even enjoying the work I'm doing as a result of that, right? I'm not able to take risks which could actually reap a bigger rewards, because I don't feel like I can. I don't feel like it's encouraged. I don't feel like it's expected of me. I don't feel like I'm allowed to do that, right? And actually, playing football with the EY team was a totally different experience, where I could be 100% myself, where I could enjoy myself with my colleagues in this environment. Funny enough, in this picture, I'm actually the photographer, so you'll see that I'm not actually in this picture, right? I was tempted to Photoshop myself, but hey, here we are. If I look at an example actually last week at Novartis, where I'm providing product coaching at the moment, there's another similar experience around psychological safety, where I had a meeting scheduled in my diary for around 8 a.m. And that clashes actually with my school drop-off. But seeing that meeting in my diary 2 weeks ago, I thought I'd be able to negotiate and somehow make it work. It got to that morning. My wife, half asleep, asked me, do you want me to take my daughter to school? I said no, because I felt guilty and I didn't actually want her to do even more for me than she already does, right? And then I cancelled and said to the attendees that I can't make that meeting, but have it without me and we'll catch up after. I then had feedback from one of my colleagues that actually the dynamic of that meeting really changed because I wasn't present. And usually having someone like me in that meeting allows me to manage the EQ of the situation and to understand how to approach the conversation with what was quite a tricky stakeholder. After that, I realized that actually what I should do is just block out, and I took that feedback on board and I accepted it because it was true, right? So I reflected on that. I blocked out the mornings in my diaries every time that I'm dropping my child to school so that no one actually books any meetings during that time. And that psychological safety that I had with my team allowed me, within the 3-hour feedback loop, to go from making that mistake to having that introspective and almost that retrospective action of, okay, what did I do wrong or what can I do differently? Then I actually took action and blocked out my calendar. And it's these small and simple things that actually compound over time to really create an environment where everyone can actually arrive and be themselves in these environments. Okay. The key things to really try out when it comes to psychological safety is create principles and a culture within teams where they value learning over delivery, right? We were not trying to create feature factories here, which was touched on in day one. We're here to really like optimize our learning loops. That is what we're trying to do. The second is to really test out things such as liberating structures. And liberating structures are all about using basically inclusive facilitation styles to make sure that everyone's voice is heard and acted on. So an example exercise is 1, 2, 4, all, which is an exercise which I've got a link to in the reference, but touches on the fact that you get contributions from everyone individually. Then you pair people up to combine their ideas. Then you pair people up again to combine their ideas until finally we have a voting round, and whoever's the idea owner, whether it's the product manager or whoever in that meeting, then makes a decision based on a short list of ideas. The final thing that teams could do is hold a fear conversation where you understand actually what people's fears are, what their norms are, and actually how we can address those fears to make sure that it's truly an inclusive space for all. The second principle that I really touch on is the importance of having a common purpose, right? And the two key questions I ask leaders to ask teams to really understand where the gaps are in terms of this perception is, do we fundamentally believe that the work we're doing matters, right? And secondly, how does the company priorities link to the product team objectives? That first one is really about tying my personal aspirations to actually the vision of what this company is trying to achieve, right? So if the world is fundamentally different tomorrow based on us succeeding, why does that matter? And the second one is about cascading our objectives down to goals on a team level so that there's a clear link between what I'm doing as a team and how it contributes to the bigger picture of what we're doing as a company, right? And this is missing with a lot of companies. And I'm going to touch on how we can use OKRs to do that in a second. All right. So I talk about this concept of, Simon Sinek's golden circle, understanding the why behind what we do, agreeing on the what with leaders of teams like product managers and product owners, but then empowering them to figure out the how, right? Because the teams have to own the metrics. The teams have to own the experiments. The teams have to have the autonomy to try and figure out what works, right? The agreement is on those objectives and key results, okay? The other kind of framework to look at is actually how do our OKRs really cascade? Like, do they cascade down in the right way? Because if they do, it should create high alignment and ownership, right? Every team should really understand their responsibility in contributing to the mission, right? I don't know if you read this OKRs book about mission to metrics, which is all about talking about like actually one of your jobs as leaders is to really define what the mission is of the company and to make sure that everyone understands it, right? The rest is about translating that mission into what metrics everyone is responsible for, right? And teams need to feel empowered and have a sense of ownership in order to own that journey, okay? And I think that high alignment, honestly, is a prerequisite and a core prerequisite for autonomy. The next is around clarity over roles and ensuring that people have clear understandings of what their roles are. And there's a workshop that I often facilitate with teams around self-organization and what that actually means in practice, because there's often different opinions on what that means on the ground, okay? And in this workshop, what I do usually is I send around a template for everyone to describe what each other's responsibilities are within a team privately, right? And to send that template back to me as a facilitator. So actually, who has ownership over what? Who is responsible for what? And then actually, what are the role titles that you assign, which is actually less important. It's really about the cluster of responsibilities that people come up with. And then hopefully at the end of this exercise, we understand where the commonalities are, differences, and the capability gaps between team members. And often there's a difference in perception between leadership and the actual teams on the ground that are sometimes doing the work. So it's actually a healthy exercise to do every 6 to 12 months, depending on how long lasting the teams are or how much change there are within team members of a single team. So with clear roles, actually, there's some really important notes to also take into consideration as well. One is that roles will evolve and improve over time. They're not going to be static. Teams are constantly evolving, right? The second is that team members might have several roles at the same time. And that's why it's really useful to do that exercise to understand actually if one team member is technically doing maybe 1 or 2 roles, and actually over time, what does that look like for that the role to grow so big that it needs to be split into either a new hire or someone else's role, right? Peer-to-peer accountability and feedback is crucial, right? It's 3 and 4. Like having those peer reviews to support each other to learn and grow and creating that culture where we feel psychologically safe to do so is key, right? We shouldn't have to have all these HR processes to get us into 360 reviews. We need a culture of regular introspection and adaptation. And we need to get that into our culture so it becomes more of a norm, right? When it comes to decision-making protocols, one of the protocols that I want to walk through today is actually consent decisions. All right, and this comes from sociocracy, right? And consent decisions are all about first presenting a proposal, like what is the ask? Then each person can ask clarifying questions to say, you know, what are the things that they need to understand a little bit more, a little bit deeper. And if there is no question, they can just say no question, and we skip to the next person within that meeting room. Once everyone has understanding, then we can see the reactions from different people. Right? Like actually, like how does it make people feel? What does it make them think? Like, do they really understand the context? How much support is there for this idea? Is there small amendments that people want to make? Right? And this needs to be time box discussion because as you can imagine, these kind of discussions can go widely and go on for ages, if not time boxed. And then that's followed by a voting round to see actually who really consents versus objects to these ideas. And the team members with objections then have an opportunity to present those objections one by one so they can share their concerns. Then finally, there's a decision, right? And one of 3 things can really happen. There's either partial consent to say actually the majority of people in this room agree. There's either overriding objections, so actually we are not going to go forward with this proposal because of these objections. Or you might end up with a disagree and commit, right? Which Amazon talk about a lot and Jeff Bezos, right, about about a situation where actually we may have that partial consent and partial disagreement, but we're going to commit to this anyway. And usually that results in some sort of a pilot or some sort of an experiment to test things out to come to a more informed decision as to whether to take this proposal forward or not. During this talk, by the way, feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll address them at the end of the talk. Another thing that's been really useful that I've used with teams is boundary conditions. And there's different ways of doing this. Okay, but boundary conditions are really about giving that team empowerment and ownership over what they do and agreeing what boundary conditions there are for when leadership, when things need to get escalated for leadership to help unblock or get unstuck. Okay, so the key thing with the boundary decision conditions is that we need to define what are the key metrics within the team. And actually, when these key metrics, we foresee that we're not going to hit these key metrics, and it could be on the feature, it could be on the product, it could be even on the project cost, quality, or timing, or other success factors, that's when we have an escalation path. Okay, so if the team is on target with these key metrics, the management should leave the team to carry on with their autonomy to get on with things, right? Just let's stay out of the way. We assume they're on track. Should the team foresee that it could cross these boundaries, that's when there has to be a clear escalation process to get the team back on track, right? So the team must first inform senior management, right, immediately that actually they foresee things going off track. Secondly, they should propose a solution, right? They thought about it and these are the options that they foresee. Then senior management agrees with the team on what solution they should give a try, right? And then they inform the team as quick as possible, right? Through email, chat, Slack, not with a lengthy analysis and another email on what went wrong, but rather focusing on solutions so that we can get things back on track. And the important thing is to get teams back on track in a matter of hours or days and not weeks, right? If the management team doesn't really agree with the solutions, then like as a last resort, like a meeting can be called to discuss how to solve this, what we call like this boundary break, or change the boundary conditions in question. And we call this actually the out of bounds meeting. Okay, so that's one way of making decisions, right? Having that boundary conditions as the parameter for when we need to have these meetings with management. Another is the zone of possible agreement, right? And this really comes down to when we're negotiating on, for example, certain key metrics or certain key results if we're using OKRs, right? So this example here on the screen is actually with a car seller who is willing to sell his car at a minimum of $4,500, or at a maximum, they would love to get up to $7,000 for that car, right? And then you have a buyer who wants to get as cheap as possible, if possible, but is willing to pay up to £5,000. So that zone of possible agreement is somewhere between $4,500 and $5,000, right? And with all negotiations, it's really important to understand actually what's the walkaway position and actually what's the maximum that we can really stretch to in terms of goals or key results. Okay, and that's why it's important when we have these systems like OKRs that we actually track the progress every month before we have our check-ins every quarter, right? We need these kind of mechanisms to keep us accountable and transparent over how things are going, rather than the lengthy reporting on velocity or story points or these sometimes false indicators when actually we're trying to optimize the learning loop and make sure that we're delivering value to customers early and often. So that comes back actually to feedback systems, right? So regular retrospectives within teams are really important because that is the forum where we can continuously improve as we consider what things are going well that we should continue, what things are not going so well that we should stop, and what are the things that we should consider starting. And the mistake that I see with most retrospectives with teams is that they don't take actions that they're accountable for and follow through on. So that in the next retro, they can actually discuss the actions and how and what came from taking those actions. Okay. The key thing in terms of learning loops is that not only are we learning as a team how to improve as a team, but we're also learning continuously from customers on how we can continue to improve and iterate on our product to deliver their value, because by delivering customer value, we're ultimately delivering that business value that we aspire to. Okay. Another mistake that team is making, another anti-pattern that emerges, is that we're really harsh in these retrospectives and we talk all about all of the things that we did wrong and all of the things that we changed. And we don't actually take time out to celebrate our victories, which are equally important. We need to be celebrating our victories and really giving each other a high five when things go well. And the last thing in terms of an anti-pattern that emerges in cultures is that management should foster a culture of team recognition over individual contribution, right? So what behaviors do we want to incentivize and encourage? We want teams to perform together. We want high-performing teams. We don't want individual contributors and solo performers, right? So how we incentivize that really matters. I'm going to quickly walk through like how inspirational and how amazing it is to have watched F1 Drive to Survive on Netflix. All right, I'm clapping. That's how excited I am about this program. I don't know who else has watched this show yet, but it's incredible. All right, and there's so many lessons for founders and founding teams on how F1 really drive, no pun intended, high performance within their teams. Okay, especially about their fast feedback loops and how they experiment and learn continuously. So if we look at actually F1, it's very similar actually to a startup. Like the sponsor is like your investor. The team principal, if you like, is like your founder or your product manager. And then they have designers and engineers constantly working on their cars, right, to improve their performance. And then the whole season is literally like working in agile. Like your season schedule is like your roadmap. Your pre-race planning is like your sprint planning. Your qualifying race before the actual race weekend is like your user acceptance testing. Your race day is like your release after you've made these incremental improvements between each race. And then the debriefing after the race with up to 40 people is like your retrospective to look back at what went well, what didn't go so well, or what we could improve, right? And actually, F1 is actually a really good case study for all 6 of the principles we've discussed, because there's psychological safety that's fostered and encouraged. And we see it here with the drivers really standing up and using their platform for Black Lives Matter. You know, we have to have a common purpose within our teams. There we see Valtteri Bottas, who's actually Lewis Hamilton's number 2 at Mercedes and probably less famous as a result, but it's a team sport. And if not for Valtteri Bottas, often obscuring, you know, Red Bull and their competitors, like essentially protecting Lewis to secure the win, actually it would be difficult for Lewis to do so. The third thing is like we have really clear roles, and I think the pit stop is a great analogy for that. Pit stops are up to 3 seconds long. Everyone has to be super efficient over getting their job done, right? Then we have decision making. Look how complex the wheel is, and the driver's steering wheel is for an F1 driver. Like, you need to communicate so much within that wheel to drivers and back in order to understand how we can really iterate while it's actually in production, while it's on the track. Then the feedback systems I've touched on already with the post-race debriefs. Then finally, they're constantly experimenting and learning and thinking how they can out-innovate each competitor as they make improvements to their race cars. Okay. So just again, to quickly summarize, like, psychological safety underpins all 6. All right. The frameworks, whether we're talking about agile frameworks and, the Spotify model, they're all just tools, and they're not going to work unless we have the culture and the foundations that are required to enable them to work. Autonomy requires trust, transparency, and regular feedback loops between leadership and the teams, right? We're all in the same company. It's not them and us, right? And then finally, it's all about continuous improvement and that spirit of iterating towards what actually works for you, rather than just taking a framework off the shelf and applying it and expecting results. Okay, so I've tried to really race through the end of that talk so that we have time for a few questions before I have to nip off to the Angel Investing School. There's a few references here at the back, and again, I'm happy to share the links and the references after this talk. Thank you. And like I said, any questions, feel free to ask it in the chat, and I think Precious or Devon will ask the questions to me.
I have returned. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I love the F1 energy. I'm not a fan myself, but, I'm sure there are a couple of people here who are. I guess I have a question in terms of, you talked about how psychological safety underpins everything, but how exactly have you seen it encouraged well in the very early stage? Because I think a lot of managers would be able to talk about it, but how do you actively encourage it from the beginning?
So I think, like, even before we start certain meetings, it's important to say things such as, like, look, I just want to say that this is an inclusive space where judgment is being deferred. Honestly, feel free to ask any questions. I've asked all the stupid questions. Really laying out the law of the land at the beginning of a meeting helps to frame what environment we're stepping into, right? And having even the leaders ask questions and be vulnerable with teams helps to show that actually this is a flat structure, and there's that safety amongst everyone, not just you and us.
I hear that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, okay, so that's about how you open up those conversations at the start. But what happens if the organization, because, you've worked with some bigger ones, what happens if they've then fallen into, like, those traps already of, like, anti-patterns? Like, how do you pull it back?
Yeah, so the key thing is a great question. I've just seen it in the Q&A poll, that the key thing with these anti-patterns is that we need to establish where we are today, what patterns have emerged, what is our desired outcome of where we want to get to, and let's actually, like, experiment on different ways to solve that, right? And in every sprint or whatever the time period is, let's check in on the progress from that experiment. What are the results? Treat it similar to treat your product, right? What are the results we see? Do we need to keep on doing what we're doing? Do we need to try something different? Do we need to kill this and try something completely different? And you just iteratively make improvements that way, because culture is like a muscle. If you go to the gym for 1 day a week, like, you're not going to see results. If you go consistently over 3 months, 6 months, then you start to see actually that muscle really develop.
Yeah. I mean, that is true wisdom. You've got to think about it like an organism, because I guess your organization is an organism at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Constantly evolving, constantly changing, constantly adapting. And in a marketplace that's constantly changing and adds that pressure onto you as you try to grow fast while being conscious of all of these anti-patterns and patterns.
100%. Well, Andy, thank you so much. I know you have to jump off into the angel investing.
No, I'm so sorry.
No, I mean, hopefully we'll see you around tomorrow, maybe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And all of my details are there, so feel free to connect with me directly and ask any questions, and I can dive deeper into that as well. But thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great one.
My pleasure.
Well, guys, that's the end of our scheduled talks for the second day of Product Summit. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you've taken a lot out of it. We're now going to move into those sessions on the left-hand side of your screen. I believe I'll have to point that way, where we have Tyler, the founder of Parler, talking about sustainability. So that will be one of our Seedcamp founder-led sessions. So yeah, please jump into the session right now, where you'll get to discuss sustainability, a very important topic of the day. We'll see you there. And of course, don't forget to join us tomorrow as well for the final day of Product Summit, where we'll be joined by Valerio, we'll be joined by Karen. Check out the agenda and please do drop that feedback. It's very helpful for us. All right, we'll see you soon.